Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Omar Harami, and thank you for joining us for the latest Kumi Now online gathering as we look at the current situation of Palestinian refugees around the world. Our guests today are Nader Abu Amsha and Lubna Shomali of Badil Resource Center. Before we start, I'd like to remind you that this session is being broadcasted live on Facebook. If you do not wish to appear, please turn off your video feed. We would also love it if you could quickly share one of the links that are being shared currently in the chat so that others may join. We're now inviting people from the audience to tell us how you are applying Kumi Now back in your community or are otherwise advocating for Palestine. If you have an idea or a project you'd like to share, up to 5 minutes in a future meeting, please email us at kumi@kuminow.com. Now it's time for our activism survey. Mark, could you launch the poll, please? Please note that there are 3 questions, so scroll down for the third. So the first, thank you. The first question asked about your activism for the week. We appreciate your responses. The answer to number 2 is the third answer, 8 million. At least 8.7 of the 13 million Palestinians around the world are forcibly displaced persons. Among these Palestinians who have been forcibly displaced are close to 8 million refugees. The rest are internally displaced persons. And the answer to question number 3 is the first answer, Jordan. UNRWA estimates that half of the refugees forced out of the occupied Palestinian territories in 1967 were also refugees from 1948. We hope that you will find today's gathering interesting and informative. I'd like to start by having everyone you'll be seeing today introduce themselves. Nader Abu Amsha.
Yes, my name is Nader Abu Amsha. I'm volunteering as the chairperson of the Badil, Palestinian Center for Residency and Refugees' Rights.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lubna Shomali. I am the Advocacy Manager at Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights.
Thank you, Lubna and Nader. We're looking forward for spending time with you. As it is tradition, we will be sharing an update on the ground. So I hope you can see the screen. Good. So I try to stick with news that hasn't been very popular on the mainstream media. Bab al-Amud, the Israeli police and the Israeli army are losing their mind. Now they're arresting people only for drinking coffee at Bab al-Amud. So we've had many times such incidents, but not to the extent that it is happening currently at Damascus Gate in Jerusalem. So people are getting arrested only just for drinking coffee at Damascus Gate. It's outrageous. They see people drinking coffee at Palestinian centers as an art of resistance. There is a very scary new phenomena in Jerusalem. There are groups of settlers who are dedicated to pepper spraying Palestinian children. So in the last week, 14 cases have been documented, at least 14 cases. Palestinian children have become the target of Israeli settlers using pepper spray. Is being very much promoted on social media. The attacks are not only happening on Palestinian children, but also attacks are happening in the middle of the night with either graffiti or attacking Palestinian civilians and elderly. There was a woman over 80 who was attacked while she was at her home near Nablus. Settlers are organizing attacks on Palestinian villagers in groups. It looks from for somebody who's just seeing these pictures, it looks like a family gathering. They bring women, children, young people, older people. They march with flags, with their guns, and with the protection of the Israeli army into Palestinian villages, setting places on fire or attacking the local community. This behavior, although would happen every now and then, but not on a periodical basis. So this is a very serious development. Palestinians in different villages, especially in the Jordan Valley, are gathering, and as communities are also resisting the violations and the intimidations of Israeli settlers and the Israeli army. It's also, the attacks are happening as a family event by settlers. Also, Palestinians are also, it's the whole village are also resisting as a family. The situation is terrible in many of these villages, especially this photo was taken from Beta village. It's very disturbing. Things seem as if we're going into a civil war, although we are actually under occupation by Israel. Khadr Adnan has been arrested over 15 times by Israel, and he is currently arrested on his 20th day going through a hunger strike. He is a main person who continues to resist administrative detention when Israel arrests people without charging them. And Israel ends up releasing him because of the hunger strike. He started this form of resistance, and Israel continues to arrest him at least once or twice a year. And he continues to go on a hunger strike. It seems like a never-ending story. Attacks and settler tours are continuing inside Al-Aqsa Mosque with intimidation. The country is very tense, and it feels as if it's a ready country for a disaster. So I hope you found my contribution helpful, my update, and we move to the main topic of today. So Nader, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Omar, and thank you, Sabil, and everybody. Yeah, actually, the mission and the main strategy of Badil is strongly related to what has been shown. This kind of ongoing, continuous Nakba that we are living under. As you know, I think the voice is coming from a street seller here. I'll put the headphones. I hope it's better now. Do you hear me?
Yes, it is, Nader.
Okay. So I believe that this is very relevant. What has been shown is very relevant to what we are advocating against, and what we are struggling for in Badil. That we believe that a Nakba is not an event happened and not something happened in the past in 1948 or before or after. It's something continuous. It's about ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and replacing them and taking their homeland as a state for Jews. So the whole story is all about this. What's happening today is totally and strongly related to what's happening, what we are talking about. what happened in Sheikh Jarrah, in Jordan Valley, in Old City of Jerusalem, Old City of Hebron, in the western villages of Bethlehem, in the north and everywhere in Palestine is about that. And even what's happening in so-called Israel now is also goes in the same direction by pushing pushing Palestinians to immigrate, by racism and ethnic cleansing Palestinians from the who are living in Israel now. And so we believe that this issue is continuous. This issue is should be addressed in this way. We strongly believe that Israel, since established, is using two major strategies. One strategy is to create facts on the ground, heavy facts, criminal facts on the ground that can't be changed, or they believe that it can't be changed. Colonies or called settlement are an example. Bringing people from Russia, Ethiopia, Europe, wherever, to live in hills of Bethlehem, for example, and seeing people living there and being born there as a young child, and seeing your father or your family building their house. This means for you that this is your homeland, this is your property, this is your place, regardless how this happened and how father or family managed with the property and the land. Then it's a fact that there is community, huge community. Now they are defending their right to extend this kind of illegal presence. And then it became very, very heavy fact. And at the same time, the other strategy goes with hiding this kind of crime. We believe that these two strategies, committing crimes, heavy facts on the ground, and hiding these crimes, are the main strategies happening. And when you discover this, when you disclose all of this kind of illegality, you will be accused as hating Jews or anti-Semitic or whatever. So we believe that it's time to for us to dare to stop, to continue our struggle to for the rights of refugees and for the right to return, and at the same time, dare to not fearing this kind of accusation, this kind of criminalization, this kind of demonization of activists who believe in rights and who believe in human rights and humanitarian rights. We strongly believe also that bypassing the refugee issue or the right to return was the strategy in the negotiations and the continuous strategy of the occupation. They tried this in Oslo, and they tried to postpone it as a trial to create a new fact and a trial to make this impossible as well. And we know, all of us know now where is Oslo agreement is. Oslo agreement now is both sides actually are understanding that it's not anymore relevant to solution. We believe that the right to return and addressing the refugee issue is the key issue that should be addressed. The key issue should be tackled. It's not one of the key issues, I believe, and I strongly believe that this is the key issue in solving the Palestinian Israeli conflict or the Palestinian Zionist conflict. This kind of historical theft of property, historical theft of land, historical dehumanization of Palestinians can't continue and can't be forgotten or bypassed. I believe for us as activists, we should keep this flame, lighted, and we should continue putting this as a top priority in whatever advocacy acts we're doing, and whatever work we are doing for creating real peace and justice in Middle East. So I just share these general comments, but I will leave the floor for my colleague Lubna, who's a professional on this and who's going to do the presentation on behalf of Badil. Thank you.
Thank you, Nader. I do have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to set that up now. Hold on. Okay, can everyone see the slide?
Yes, Lubna, we can see them.
Okay. As Nader said, Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee, well, I don't know if he said this, but Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Residency and Refugee Rights was created in 1998, 5 years after Oslo, for the specific purpose of promoting and defending the rights of Palestinian refugees. Badil sees the most adequate description of the situation in Palestine, as Nader said, as the ongoing Nakba, not something that took place in the past or only exists in our history, but is something that is unfortunately part of our present and unfortunately part of our future. And so this is the terminology that Badil uses, an ongoing Nakba, to describe the situation in Palestine as part of two components, where the Zionist movement prior to the creation of Israel and then the Israeli government upon the creation of Israel continues to displace and dispossess the Palestinian people, at the same time denying their return. So it's a combination of both the displacement and dispossession and the denial of return. And that's what Badil describes as the ongoing Nakba. They do this in order to control the maximum amount of land with the minimum number of Palestinians. And as the Israeli, and as the illustration in front of you shows, that as Israel continued to control, as Israel took over and controlled more and more of Palestine, of Palestinian land, more and more Palestinians became displaced. So when we look at the situation in 1917, at the start of the British Mandate, we can see that the land in Palestine belonged to Palestinians, or was under the control of Palestinians. And as time goes on, the more land that Israel was able to confiscate and annex, the Palestinian population continued to dwindle by this displacement and dispossession. So through the combination of displacing and dispossessing Palestinians and preventing them from returning, Israel is able to control the maximum amount of land with the minimum number of Palestinians. Badil is a human rights organization, and we base our comprehensive analysis on multiple frameworks of international law. That is to say that we don't stop at IHL, which is international humanitarian law, or the law of war and conflict. We also use international human rights law, international refugee law, international criminal law to use in our research and our analysis in describing the situation in Palestine. And so it's very important for us when people talk about Palestine, or the discourse around Palestine uses the proper terminology. terminology. And I know that we are shifting here a little bit to the legal side, but I ask that you bear with me. It's very important that we're all on the same page in this regards. So according to international law, there are two types of displaced persons: refugees and internally displaced persons, or IDPs. Refugees are individuals that have been, or groups that have been forcibly displaced and have been forced across an internationally recognized border. So Palestinians who were displaced outside of mandatory Palestine during the British Mandate, or Palestinians who were displaced outside of what came to be called Israel and entered into the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, or the surrounding countries, those individuals are referred to as refugees under international law. If you are forcibly displaced and remain within the entity, or you do not cross an internationally recognized border, then you are classified as an internally displaced person, or an IDP. Now, regardless of whether you are a refugee or IDP, because the distinction is kind of geographical, you have the same rights under international law. And we can talk about basically two buckets of rights here, or two groupings of rights. One can be listed under the grouping of the right to live in dignity during the period of your displacement, in which your basic needs are met so that you can live at a certain quality of life. The other one is your right to return. So we'll be getting back to those rights off and on throughout the presentation, but I just wanted you to keep those in mind for now. And in order to understand what creates a refugee or an IDP, we also have to understand what international law constitutes as force. What is force under international law? Well, there are basically two types of force. One is the force that is derived from armed and violent conflict, what we saw in 1948, what we saw in 1967, what happened with the wars on Gaza, what we saw in Syria, what happened during the Iraq wars, what happened during World War I, World War II. And this is the most visible type of force, where you have armed, very violent conflict, armed conflict, that creates a situation in which there are shifts in the population, or there is movement on the ground due to this force. And even there is violent physical removal of people from their places of origin or habitual residence. And so it is the easiest to see, or the easiest to recognize in terms of the two types of force that are recognized by international law. The second type of force recognized by international law is what is called the coercive environment, or in layman's terms, a creation of a situation that is so unbearable that an individual really has no choice but to leave his or her place of origin or habitual residence. Now, how does one go about creating a coercive environment? Well, the creation of a coercive environment is created by the violation of one or more basic rights. Things like the violation of the freedom of movement, violating access to healthcare or education, when there is a lack of adequate housing or adequate living, when there is no access to water and natural resources, when there is the threat of suppression or actual suppression or oppression. So the coercive environment is not as easy to see. The force caused by the coercive environment is not as easy to see as the traditional force. But regardless, within international legal frameworks, both are recognized as force, and both are recognized as the catalyst for creating refugee and IDP populations. Now, in order to deal with the situation in 1948, where approximately 750,000 Palestinians found themselves displaced outside of what came to be called Israel, and another 40 to 60,000 found themselves displaced inside what came to be called Israel, the United Nations created two agencies. We'll talk about UNRWA or the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. Remember when I was talking about the two buckets of rights that belong, or refugees and IDPs are entitled to: the right to live in dignity during the period of their displacement and the right to return. Well, UNRWA was mandated by the UN to address that first bucket of rights. So UNRWA was created as an agency mandated to provide humanitarian aid and assistance so that Palestinian refugees and IDPs could live in dignity during the period of their displacement. So UNRWA, in the initial phases of the Palestinian refugee crisis in 1948, was providing things like blankets, tents, food, medicine, clothing, water, etc., etc. As the Palestinian refugee situation became more protracted, or in other words, as Israel continued to deny Palestinian refugees and IDPs their right to return, UNRWA became more of a service delivery type of organization, and they provide basically three main services, or attempt to provide three main services. One of them is education, and so you hear a lot about in the news about the UNRWA schools, and whenever UNRWA has a budget deficit, some of the things that they say is that they will have to force the schools to close. There are approximately 500,000, or approximately 500,000 Palestinian refugees enrolled in the UNRWA schools. So we're talking about a significant population of Palestinians who are reliant on the UNRWA schools for their education. The other service that they provide is healthcare. So you will see UNRWA clinics as well in recognized refugee camps. And then the third service they provide is kind of a lump all of services, of social services to particularly marginalized Palestinian families and communities. The other agency that was created by the UN is the UNCCP, or the United Nations Conciliation Commission on Palestine. Now, interestingly enough, the UNCCP was actually created before UNRWA. They were created within UN Resolution 194, which I'm sure you all know is the main UN resolution that speaks specifically to the right of return of Palestinian refugees and IDPs. That resolution also created the UNCCP. And the UNCCP was created in order to address that second bucket of rights, or that second part of entitlements that displaced people are owed, which is the right of return. So the UNCCP was tasked with the facilitation, coordination, and implementation of the right of return of Palestinian refugees and IDPs. Now, why did the international community create these two agencies for Palestinian refugees? Is it because they felt sorry for them? Is it because they just thought, oh, what the heck, let's create these agencies? Is it because, quote unquote, as Israel says, the Palestinian refugees are exceptional? All of these things are not true. These are all false assumptions or false beliefs about why the UN created these two agencies. As a matter of fact, these two agencies, or the creation of this protection framework, which is what it is, in order to provide the Palestinian refugee community with the protection that they are entitled to, is obligatory upon the international community. And that is one of the reasons why shortly after the Palestinian refugee crisis, the United Nations also created the 1951 Refugee Convention and the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, in order to address such refugee crises. It's just that the Palestinian situation came first, and so from that situation, they were able to use it as a catalyst for a stronger commitment to addressing refugee situations. Now, unfortunately, there are a number of, so it's not because the Palestinian refugee community is exceptional. I think that the only way that we are exceptional is that because we are one of the most protracted refugee situations in the world. And this is because we are in a situation in which the entity that caused our displacement continues to deny our return. And this is very important to know. The only way your refugee or IDP status can be resolved is when you are allowed to exercise your right of return. And this addresses another Israeli false talking point, which says that the refugee status cannot be inherited. And this is false because of that principle, that the only way your refugee status can be resolved, if you are a descendant of a refugee, then you are also automatically a refugee. And this isn't the case just for Palestinians. This is the case in all refugee situations, whether you're an Afghan refugee or a Syrian refugee or a Serbian refugee, et cetera, et cetera. The only way your refugee or IDP status can be resolved is when you are allowed to exercise your right of return. And so refugee status, yes, is inherited, and this is not exclusive to the Palestinian situation. It is only the case for us because Israel is the exclusive agent that continues to deny our return. So, with the creation of UNRWA and UNCCP, the intention of the international community was to provide protection to Palestinian refugees and IDPs. Unfortunately, there are a number of structural deficiencies within UNRWA. And of course, the work of the UNCCP was blocked by the United States and Israel. And so even though the UNCCP continues to exist today, they are a non-operational UN organization. They have no practical activities, let's say, or no real activities on the ground. They do submit a report to the UN each year on the progress that they have been made with regards to their mandate. And so each year the UNCCP submits a report to the UN that says no progress has been made, because to this day, no progress has been made. Not one single Palestinian refugee or IDP has been allowed to exercise their right of return. Now, bear this in mind. We have a situation of ongoing displacement and dispossession. We also have a continuous denial of return. And the protection that is supposed to be offered or supposed to be in place, protection framework that is in place, that was put in place by the international community, has failed. And so what does this mean? What does this mean practically for Palestinian refugees and IDPs? It means that we are the largest and most protracted refugee population in the world. Now, those of you who answered that poll, good job, by the way. According to Badil's numbers, and these are accurate up to 2018, there are 8.7 million people, 8.7 million Palestinians who have been displaced, and they are either refugees or IDPs or both. This constitutes, so we can wrap our minds around this number, right? 8.7 million, the largest and most protracted refugee population in the world. That's 66% of the Palestinian population, 66%, 2/3. Break it down even more. That means that out of every 10 Palestinians you meet, 7 of them will have experienced displacement at least once in their lifetime, with significant numbers having experienced it more than once. And here's where we start talking about secondary displacement. And we saw it, for example, we saw Palestinians who were originally displaced in 1948, who were displaced again in 1967. We also saw it during the 3 wars on Gaza. When Israel would bomb certain areas in Gaza, Palestinians became displaced again. And we know that in the Gaza Strip, approximately 85% of the Palestinian population there are refugees or descendants of refugees. And so they could have potentially experienced displacement 4 times. Once in 1948, let's say, and another 3 times each time Israel perpetrated a military assault on Gaza. We also saw that situation in Syria. Approximately 500,000 Palestinian refugees had resided in Syria up until the recent conflict, which is still kind of ongoing. When they fled, as their Syrian counterparts fled, they were denied entry, for example, specifically by Jordan and Lebanon, who did not want to host or add to the Palestinian or refugee population that they were hosting. They are also discriminated against when they seek asylum or refuge in European countries. In comparison to their Syrian counterparts as well. The mechanisms in place for the reception of asylum seekers discriminates against Palestinian refugees. And so many of them who fled either fled without the knowledge of the state to which they fled to, in which case they would not be able to access services. They are also constricted by the fact that UNRWA only operates in 5 main areas, or is only allowed to operate in 5 main areas, and that is the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, and has no mandate to be able to, for example, service Palestinian refugees who fled from Syria to, let's say, Italy, or Palestinian refugees who fled from Syria to France. So there are a number of obstacles, or let's say there are a number of discriminatory situations in place that Palestinian refugees face, not only here in mandatory Palestine, but also for Palestinian refugees in exile. Now, to give you a situation, or one of the things that we often mention is that when we talk about the Palestinian refugee situation, we are not talking about a situation that is centered in Palestine or even in the Arab region. We are talking about a situation that has international dimensions, because as you can see on the slide in front of you, Palestinian refugees actually reside in every continent on the planet, and there are significant numbers. And these numbers will continue to grow and expand, unfortunately, because as I said, with Israel having a main goal of controlling the maximum amount of land in Palestine with the minimum number of Palestinians there, we are going to continue to see displacement and dispossession, and we are going to continue to see the denial of return. So let's take a situation, a more current situation, what is happening in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. We have a situation there in which some of those Palestinian families who are in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan are actually refugees from 1948. And they were pushed into those areas by the Zionist militias prior to the creation of Israel. And they were also they were in a situation in which they were able to settle for a short period of time in Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah. Many of those properties in which they are residing were confiscated through the Israeli absentee property law. The Israeli absentee property law claims that absentees, which is code for refugees, because Israel had pushed them out and made them made them absent. Their properties were confiscated and they were all shuffled into this Israeli custodianship. And this custodianship relabeled, let's say, or rebranded those properties from absentee properties to state properties or to state land. And then they funneled those properties from state land into the hands of the Zionist Israeli colonial organizations that were claiming to purchase and own those properties. And here you can see where Israel has created a system in which they attempt to justify or legalize, in a very illegal way, by the way, the ownership of Palestinian property and land by funneling it through this system that they have created, where it goes into the custodianship, And from the custodianship, it becomes state land. And from it becoming state land, it becomes privately owned by either individuals or the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, or these Zionist Israeli colonial entities or colonial organizations. And so they go about and for evicting Palestinians from these homes and from these lands. But this is another way of creating a coercive environment, creating a situation that is unbearable. While they didn't actually use violent physical force, there is a force present in which they are put in a situation in which they have no other option but to flee, but to leave their places of origin or habitual residence. So I will stop there. And we can go to questions, I suppose. Is that what we want to do next?
Yes, thank you very much, Lubna. And there's plenty of questions coming in. So,
that's always good.
So the first question, do Nader or Lubna see the recent demonstrations by Israeli nationalists and attacks by Israeli settlers on Palestinians being encouraged by the new Israeli government with Bennett in charge?
I would say, I started actually to respond to this on the chat, but then I had to stop doing that. But I would say, I mean, what do you mean by encourage? I would definitely say encourage and even incite. Whereas we are often told that we are insightful as Palestinians because of that dehumanization that Nader was talking about earlier. But they definitely incite those kinds of attacks, and they protect them. So oftentimes, if there is a colonizer attack against Palestinians, like the pictures that Omar was showing, the Israeli military and the Israeli police are right there to ensure that Israeli Jews are protected and to make sure that Palestinians are not able to respond or to arrest them if they do respond. So it's not just about encouraging the attacks. They actually whip up a frenzy of insightfulness, I think. Just the fact that if you know that you have the Israeli military or the Israeli police at your back, you're not going to shy away from pepper spraying a Palestinian child. And you're not going to shy away from beating up an old lady in her house. You're not going to shy away from forcibly evicting Palestinians from Sheikh Jarrah or Silwan. So definitely.
Yes, I believe they are supported, they are incited by them. Actually, if you follow the declarations during the election time, that you can see kind of a race between Netanyahu and Bennett about who is going to be more rights, who's going to be more racist, who's going to be more accepted by this kind of I believe settler community. And settlers are immune all the time and guarded and supported and protected by the authorities and mainly the army, and they are there not to stop them from violating Palestinian rights, but to protect them violating Palestinian rights all the time.
So the second question is basically as the first question, but it adds one more part for Nader or Lubna. Do you think that this reflects the nature of Zionism in Israel?
Yes, I believe it's reflecting Zionism, and this is if you go to the education system, if you go to the organization system, since childhood, how they are raising up their kids, how they are raising them in the army, how they are raising them in the community, this kind of socialization process, you can't predict any kind of results but hating Arabs and criminalizing Arabs and trying to evict from where are. What we are talking about is, the right to return, and the solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is ending this kind of racist thing, which might be the only way to liberate Jews from Zionism, liberate Jews from being racist forever.
Lubna, would you like to add something, or should we move to the next question?
Oh, go ahead, move to the next question. That's
So
great
here's
answer.
here's a question from Canada, for Nader and Lubna. I work in Canada, settling refugees through the private sponsorship of refugee program. Do you support resettlement of Palestinian refugees to third countries? Do Palestinian refugees encounter resettlement difficulties because they have UNRWA registration rather than the UNHCR?
When resettlement is the only option, then yes, we don't support it. According to international law, refugees, not just Palestinian refugees, refugees and IDPs are supposed to be allowed what international calls durable solutions. And the three durable solutions in international law are voluntary repatriation or voluntary return, resettlement, or integration into the host country. You're supposed to have a choice. So if you are forced into a resettlement program, you're not really exercising your right of return, or you're not really exercising that choice, which is what right of return gives you. And so that's the case whether you're a Syrian refugee, whether you're a Palestinian refugee, whether you're an Afghanis refugee. If you don't have that choice between the durable solutions, then it's not really an exercise of your right of return. And if that is the case, then yes, we are against resettlement of Palestinian refugees. We are against resettlement of any refugee who isn't given the proper access to enjoy their right of return. Having said that, of those three durable solutions, return, resettlement, or integration, the only one that is a right is the right of return, which is the voluntary repatriation. That's the only one that is the right. The other two are contingent on the goodwill of states, which is why they are not really favored by international law. They are not seen and not preferred as the optimal solution, where the return, the voluntary repatriation is. Now, there are forced settlement schemes. When we look, for example, at the situation in Lebanon, there is a situation there in which Palestinians are being recruited into resettlement schemes elsewhere. And it's kind of kept on the down low because it's a very touchy subject. It's a very sensitive subject. But the bottom line is that the situation in Lebanon, of course, for Palestinian refugees there is quite dire. The Lebanese government is very discriminatory against Palestinian refugees, and they have laws in place that do not allow Palestinian refugees to exercise their most basic civil, cultural, and economic rights. And so they live in a situation, in a very poor and marginalized situation, despite the presence of UNRWA and their assistance that is being provided there. So there are situations in which there is programs of forced resettlement, and Palestinians are picking up these or taking advantage of these situations, particularly in the case of Lebanon, because the situation is so dire. But that does not mean that their refugee status has been resolved. It does not mean that they have exercised their right of return or have been given adequate access to their right of return.
Nader, would you like to add something?
No, nothing to add.
Okay, so the fourth question, why are Palestinian refugees not recognized by the UNHCR?
UNRWA was created before UNHCR. And as I said, the Palestinian refugee crisis was kind of like the catalyst for the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is kind of like the Bible for UNHCR. And there is a clause, and I'm going to try not to get too technical here, but unfortunately I have to because we're talking about international law. There is a clause within the 1951 Refugee Convention that says if a refugee is under the protection of any other UN agency, then they cannot fall under the purview of UNHCR. There's another clause that says if this protection should cease to exist, then they can fall under the purview of UNHCR. So what this has done is created a situation in which the international community is asking, well, are Palestinian refugees being protected by UNRWA or are they not? And depending on how the state interprets this or decides on that question, yes, they are being protected, no, they're not, then they may or may not fall under the purview of UNHCR. But in the vast majority of cases, most states decide that Palestinian refugees, since they are being provided with services by UNRWA, they do not fall under the purview of UNHCR. Now, having said that and gone through that whole legal rigmarole, it's BS. Because as I mentioned, UNRWA and UNRWA, for a multitude of reasons, is not able to fulfill its mandate properly. And we could probably have a whole webinar on what the problems are or what the situation is with UNRWA. One of them being, of course, the lack of funding and the lack of political support to the agency. And UNCCP has ceased to function. I mean, yes, it exists, but it has ceased to function. And without those two components, without the physical protection part or the needs part that is provided by UNRWA or supposed to be provided by UNRWA, and without that capacity for protection, legal and status-wise, there is no protection. There is no protection for Palestinian refugees, and so they are falling through the protection gap. They are falling through the cracks, and the international community is refusing to recognize this situation or this lack of protection, and using the excuse that yes, they have UNRWA, so that means they have quote unquote protection, as an excuse not to put them within the UNHCR mandate, which is dictated by the 1951 Refugee Convention.
Thank you for the questions and thank you for the great responses. Unfortunately, we don't have time to answer every question today. We'll now move to our activism time. Ryan, could you please put the Kumi action on the screen? These options will also be shared in the chat, and all of the text is available on the web page for this gathering. Also shared in chat or accessible from our kuminow.com homepage under the Kumi Online Gatherings section near the bottom of the page. So today's Kumi action, which you can see on the left, is to remind your country's mission to the United Nations of the UN's commitment to Palestinian refugees. All of the links you will need to find your country's physical and email addresses will be shared in the chat or are being shared in the chat. Nader and Lubna, do you have any thoughts on what advocacy our viewers should engage in at this moment as they're doing, taking action currently?
Go ahead, Nader. No,
Yeah, go ahead. No. You are the advocacy officer.
I mean, I am, but I think when we were having our pre-meeting meeting last night, I thought that this was a fantastic idea, this Kumi action. And one of the things that we have been advocating for or have been pushing recently in the last year or so is this new approach by our partners, and by partners I mean our international donors, to politically conditionalize our funding. And so they have incorporated clauses into their contracts, into our granting contracts, that basically force us to acknowledge that our political parties are quote unquote terrorist organizations. And this means that they have criminalized our resistance movement and basically told us that we can't exercise our right to resist, or made our right to resist illegitimate. And so we launched a campaign along with over 300 Palestinian civil society organizations to try to pressure, or to try to lobby our international partners into not including these clauses. And I know that some people get very they get very uncomfortable when we talk about money or when we talk about funds. But the bottom line is that many of our organizations, because of these anti-terrorism restrictions, are not able to raise funds like through crowdfunding and through individual donations and so on and so forth. And so we rely very heavily on institutionalized funding, or funding that is coming from these INGOs who are being funded by their ministries of foreign affairs. And if these governments choose to incorporate these clauses, and if we take a principled position, which is what we have done at Badil, then that means that we won't be able to access those funds, or we won't be able to have those funds in order to do the work that we do. And so I'd like for you to keep some of these things in mind when you are speaking to, or when you have these actions, and pressuring your representatives and so on to consider not only the issue of the right of return, but also other situations that are very, very much affecting how we work and the kind of work that we can do. And it's not, as I said, it's not just affecting organizations like Badil, but it's also affecting a number of organizations. This initiative, or this, was put in place originally by the EU. So it started with EU funding, but unfortunately it's also kind of leached out into the individual member states. So for example, we at Badil, I think we have lost three or four of our major donors, because we had to either terminate contracts or not renew contracts because of these conditional clauses. And so this is also something to keep in mind when you hear about this issue, and so that you have some kind of background to understand what is really happening there.
Yeah, I think also we should look at it from a struggle point of view. I believe what has been done is that the Zionists managed to push the EU and some other donors to put this as conditioned in the funding, because they believe that mainly funding NGOs, funding Palestinian human rights organizations, and funding Palestinian NGOs will continue developing the tools to disclose the crimes that Israel is doing. So they continue in the same strategy to hide the crime, and the only voice that can reach people is the voice of the NGOs these days. So when we mute these NGOs, we will manage to continue hiding the crime. So I believe that this is part of our struggle, and it should be taken seriously, as serious as other steps. It's not just about money; it's about the continuation of the NGOs, the continuation of human rights organizations, and the continuation of the real voice of the Palestinian people to reach people outside.
Thank you, Nader and Lubna. So it has been the tradition that Raim plays music just to put us in the mood of the activism. So I know some people. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you all for your activism. Thank you everyone for joining us today. A link to a video of this gathering, along with all of the links shared today, will be available on the Kumi Now website and on YouTube in a day or so. And it would be shared in the next newsletter. You can subscribe to Kumi Now on YouTube and subscribe to our newsletter and make sure you receive them. We would greatly appreciate if you shared this amazing session with your friends and colleagues, as well as information on our future sessions. And please continue to promote the Kumi action, encourage people to send emails to their representatives. I'd like to thank our guests, Mr. Nader Abu Amsha and Lubna, for being with us today. Thank you for your time and for your work. And we appreciate your commitment for the struggle of Palestinians for justice and peace. Next week, we will look at developments in the lives of Palestinians. We will look at, I have forgot what's next week's session, Ryan. So next week we have another Kumi action, Kumi week. I'm sorry for this. So hope to see you next week. You will receive the information via email on the website next week's event. Thank you and appreciate everything that you guys are doing, and take care. Next week is actually, yes, next week is on nuclear Israel. So we're discussing Israel as a nuclear weapon. We have guests from Japan who will be giving us testimonies of the effects of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the dangers of nuclear weapons in the world. So in solidarity, and look forward to seeing you next week. Take care, friends.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Lubna.